spiritual application, that's where you use the principles of tell. Okay? And this is actually from Forgiven. I pulled these just from a handful of chapters. These are just a few spots where I was having to jump periods of time, and it was very simple. 1 or 2 sentences of tell lets you jump to a further page. So writing the book, make sure we have how we all in time. How do you write a book? I hope you can now see how to put the context. Just think stories, told chronology, connected with solid telling transitions, and of course spiritual application, etc. As you're writing the book, just think again, how many here love to read a good novel? I mean, you may not write it. Okay, well, if you don't, how many here love to read a really exciting biography? Okay. The point is, when you're writing a book like this, even though it is nonfiction, you want to use the principles of narrative prose. It's those same principles that make a great novel or a great biography is what makes a great true tale. So using the principles of narrative prose. We talked about this yesterday in the fiction track of using the 6 senses. And I actually have a very simple exercise that I gave them, and I'm throwing it into your notes. If you look at your prose, just take the chart, and here's the chart here. Take a chart, put your 6 senses, and of course, if you're saying, but there's not 6 senses, yes, there are for a writer. Sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and the most important sense for the writer is emotion. You can take a scene like this, and I do this with my students, and I say, okay, we're going to do a chart here. Read through there and say, and mark, and you'll see there in red, sights, the sounds, the smells. If in any vivid scene you don't have at least 3 out of the 6 senses, preferably at least 4, I find personally that taste, since we're not always eating in chapters, tends to be my least used. But if you can't make a chart like this and say, okay, I can see I'm using the 6 senses to create vivid, you probably are not writing your story with sufficiently vivid narrative prose. So I just throw that in to take a look at in your appendix, okay? And then again, writing the principles. You just quickly move through here. Dialogue, whether dialogue, writing prose, it needs to sound natural. Just think writing a good novel. And here is a good example here. This was actually another piece of raw interview, as you can see, and it's in your handout, so you don't need to look at it now. But it's telling the story of how Terry Roberts, the mother of the shooter, met her husband, which was a rather vivid story. But you will notice in that raw interview, here you have it with me turning it into actual narrative prose. And so you've got the dialogue that's natural that you have, the description. So again, we won't belabor those points. They're in your handout. But when you're writing, remember, you're not just you're not teaching a theological lesson, you're still telling a great story. So think I need to use those principles of narrative prose. And then quickly, just to run through the last points, again, writing the book, think novel. How do I divide up my book? Okay, you need to have chapter breaks. And I'll just throw this in here. I've given you some examples in the handout. But how do you know where to break up your book? And I just, again, very simply, every chapter needs to end with one of these. A significant suspense scene, question, suspense, or even a bit of the theme. And I think as you write the book, you will realize, hey, I can see logical chapter breaks. So here's just a couple of examples here. In this case, this is the first chapter of Forgiven. And of course it ends with that terrible action scene of this Christian mother actually working at a Christian ministry and getting a call and hearing, the scene was particularly interesting because she worked at Sight and Sound Theater. People who know America may know it as Broadway, but it's Christian. And she was sitting having her lunch on the patio, saw the rescue helicopters going overhead, And she said, as she did it, anytime she saw such, she prayed for whoever was in trouble. And then she gets a call on her cell phone and discovers what happened. It was her own son that had happened. So that's a good example of where to break a chapter is an exciting point. Or, again, with a suspense cliffhanger. And I will let you, or with a question, and this was with Ye Wen, one of the chapters. In America, is there a place in this vast new country called the United States for a Karen refugee like him to build a new life and home? So when you're thinking, think scenes, think chapters, think exciting chapter breaks, and then, and here's another one, or just end your chapter with a spiritual thought. We have only a few minutes. And then to finish, every book, and I want to make sure I do cover this. I want to leave a few moments for questions. But one of the things that most gets left out of this type of book is a good ending. I mentioned that a good prologue for a true life story is a spoiler. You're presenting the subject, the theme. Too often, I will be editing a book like this, and I learned only through much experience in my own writing. They will take the story, even if it's their own life story, and it was something dramatic, that's why they're writing the book, to the end of the drama. And then it ends the chapter. Well, let me tell you, by the time you have told your story, if you are writing your own, or you're writing someone else, your reader has bonded with you. If that big event happened 10 years ago and you survived, it's like, well, where are they now? Are they still married to that husband? Did their kids ever grow up to follow the Lord? And so I always say you have to have an epilogue. And there is a verse in Spanish. I always have a hard time thinking of it in English. Sorry. But it's a verse from Joshua going into the promised land, and in the speech, I think it was Moses, and he says, up to here God has led us. Hasta aquí nos ha llevado Dios. And the principle I use this is, you're telling the story, but now the reader is your friend. They care, they want to know. They want to know not just, okay, this is how the story ended, but that's not where it ended. Up to the point that you're writing this book, where has God brought you? And so always end up with a bit of an epilogue that says, okay, all that happened. Now here's where I am today. God is still faithful. And then again, and end up with the theme. And so here's examples, just a handful of here. Is always coming back to, here's where the people are today, whether you or the person you're writing, and also always come back to the final theme. And you'll see here at the end, coming back to all saints, what was the theme? Faith, community, mission. Dancing from darkness, coming back. If life is a puzzle piece, here's where I am today, this incredible woman that I want to be like when I grow up. 83 years old, still dancing professional ballet and serving God. And here's the answer. When the last puzzle piece is in place, we will see and understand the beautiful picture God is creating of our lives. Forgiven. End of the story, storm, surrender. At the end, I see the double.
How much liberty do you take in cleaning up what they say? So, on the page.
That's a perfect question. That was one of the parts that I jumped over because we were running out of time. A lot. And like if you look at that, but here is why it works. And I do this not just with books I write, but I'm a missions journalist and editor of a big missions magazine. I take liberty because I know what they mean, and they want to sound good on paper, but then I always run it back by them. So I will run it back by, and I will give them 99% of the time to this, they say, oh yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to say, I just couldn't get out the words. But sometimes they will come back and say, well, that wasn't quite what I meant, explain what I meant, and then I will adjust it because, again, if you're writing a good book, we talk in conversation and how we would be embarrassed to see end up on the pages of the book. But as long as you practice that principle of telling them nothing will ever reach print that you don't approve of, most of your interview subjects are happy to make them sound better than they did in interviews, as long as it reflects what they meant to say. that answer? Okay. Any other questions? Did I answer every question you had?
Shannon? Yeah, this sounds like more than a full-time job. It sounds, it's very useful but overwhelming. How do you,
You mean how to put all
Like-
this to practice?
yeah,
Or,
how do you do it? How do
well, let me answer that in two ways. One, I knew you would be overwhelmed, which is why I made sure that everything was in your handout so you can read it more leisurely. And let me throw this in here. If anybody wants the actual PowerPoint, I think they actually uploaded them to the, but,
Yeah.
the other, and let me just encourage this, people will say, wow, you wrote this many books. Well, I'm not that young anymore. The reality of it is, I wrote my first short story, my first article, all I knew at that time was God gave me an opening and a door and a project, and I did that one as best I could in the time He gave me. It's only now, and I won't tell you how many years, I look back and I could say, it's built up to be a fairly good body of work. But I never set out to say, how am I ever gonna have time to write? It was just the door open for one project. God made it possible that I had the time to do that well. And I will say, I don't have the stamina anymore, the stress level. Baker Group, by the way, this one, we turned around in 3.5 months. But that was for me to turn in. And Baker, sent me down to Tennessee, and it was a high pace, but I'm a little more experienced. Turning around a 3-language, triple continent book in under 2 months was the most stressful. I'm too old to do that. So I guess the answer is, when God puts a task in front of you, whether it's in somebody else's story, your own, or whatever, just do your absolute best at that, and then He'll open another door, and 20 years later, you'll look back and think, wow, when did I write all that? So does that answer?
Yeah.
Just an observation, I'm sure that you have lived with this, but that you have to be very aware of some sensitive situations, political and otherwise, and of course you have worked with this kind of thing, that they might say something that you actually cannot.
Oh, yes, and we were speaking of this before the class with somebody else. I just finished a new book, that's set in Afghanistan, and, did I mention this?
Yeah.
Okay. But again, that was one because Afghanistan is so sensitive. But that's one of the other reasons I always run everything, even in missions journalism, because we'll often have people from our field say, even though there are things they said, but it's like, we realized we need to tone that down because the political situation is. So just be, and that's part of integrity, is to say, I'm doing this to serve God and to serve the body of Christ. If something's going to be difficult, I always leave it. The last word is either the field ministry or personnel or the client to say, I don't want that in print. So it's anyway. Okay, we're out of time. I will happily answer more questions, but it just won't be on the clock.
No, I'm just wondering what happens if you are doing a subject and you find yourself emotionally really very attached or engrossed or very stirred up, and how do you manage that?
Very simply, it makes you write a much better book. By the time I finish, like with All Saints, I'm so blessed to write these stories because they're so incredible. So yeah, that's part of it. Is being emotionally invested, and that's what makes it great. If you're not willing to bleed on paper,
Yeah.
You can't be a great writer.
I'm just afraid of being sort of carried away, feeling like there's a justice issue.
Well, that's what editors are for. You write a great, I'm an editor, but I have my editors like a baker. And believe me, I finish the book, go in, and they're giving me all the feedback, and it's the same feedback I'm giving other people on their books. So, that's the good part, is you can be a great writer and pour it out, and if you have a good editor, they will pull you back to